Sandy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to dive in. Do you want to kick us off by telling us who you are, where you're from, and where you're based now?
Yep. So I am Sandy, born and bred in Sydney and currently living in Singapore and have been for the last 6 years.
Aye, but we can let listeners in on a little insight in that you're actually on the move shortly.
Yes, in 2 weeks we'll be packing up, less than 2 weeks we'll be packing up our stuff and heading home. So yeah, 6 years was the time it took. I think it felt for us that it was time to go home.
So talk me back. How did you it's not talk me back. So take me back. How did this all come about for you and your family?
Yeah, so we actually, this is our second stint overseas. We did 1 year in London where I think we just got married and we always wanted to do the London thing as everyone else in Australia was doing, the working holiday. So the plan was to be there for 2 years. I ended up getting a transfer, an assignment through work, which was great. But my husband quit his job and then was hoping to find something in London. So um, he was the trailing spouse at the time and actually didn't find anything in London. It's just after the global financial crisis. And so the plan to be there for 2 years ended up only being one for me. And he ended up leaving at about the 9-month mark to take up a job in Sydney. So our stint overseas didn't quite pan out the way that we wanted to the first time round. And then the second time round, we were like settled, bought a house in Sydney. We had a 1.5-year-old at the time. And then the call came for a potential job in Singapore for him. And so we thought about it, thought long and hard, and thought if he wants to climb the corporate ladder and, succeed in that kind of corporate world, you definitely need overseas experience. And he didn't get that in London like I did. So we were like, all right, let's just go. What have we got to lose? Again, setting ourselves kind of that 2-year time period. And then we came, and it was a very successful for us, both his career and mine. And we are both on our third jobs in Singapore after, in that 6-year time period. So we've only gone from strength to strength, I think. But yes, it was his job initially, and then I followed suit with my company. So they helped to transfer me too.
I see. So yes, you were physically trailing location-wise, but your job was portable enough to take with you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So what do you do work-wise that was one of those holy grails of places that was quite happy for you to move countries and time zones and relocate?
Global mobility. that is my my career. So originally in expat tax, and so have been well versed in obviously Australian tax and did the UK work and primarily focused on US tax. And for those of you who are tax buffs out there, people who are from the US have to file US taxes forever. So there's always work. And so I picked that up and brought that to Singapore with the company that I was with, one of those big four professional accounting firms. And so, yes.
Hang on. I can't hear you. Can you hear me? Did you just knock something at all? You were just chatting away and then it stopped. Hang on, let me pause this. Oh, hang on, you're back.
Is that better?
Yep, you're back
Hang
on.
on. I'm going to disconnect.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and your sound sounds different.
I think it was some sort of connection to my phone. It was it was saying there was some. I think it was connecting the microphone off both for some weird reason. I don't know what.
Got you. Okay. Take it back and let me ask you the question again around who you were working for.
Yeah. So I'm in the global mobility industry. And so I do expat tax, and so I could pick that up and work anywhere really. But the company I was working for was a big four accounting firm. So plenty of work, and they were able to move me fairly easily. And that's who I came with. And after a year, I didn't want to be there anymore. I was also going off on mat leave with my second child, and started to look for other in-house work. So moved to other tech companies after that. But yeah, there was a period of unhappiness when we first came here because I didn't enjoy the job. Really didn't enjoy the job.
And that's so interesting because you're the first that I've interviewed that was able to sort of take job and career with them, which quite often is like the major challenge for people because they sort of lose that work identity thing. And it is just, that coveted thing by the trailing spouse where they're able to hold on to that job that they come. But I haven't really had anyone sort of come, and while that all in theory should be fabulous, but you're actually not that particularly happy in the job that you've brought with you.
And I stayed with the same company, but the culture was so different and they treated me differently. And something that was really interesting was it was locally led, meaning that the bosses were local, Singaporean, Malaysian, that kind of thing. And they said to me at one point, because I'm quite outspoken, as we are taught to be in Australia, and if you can back it up and speak your mind. But they said to me, "You look like us, being Chinese, but you don't behave like us." And they couldn't reconcile that in their mind. And so taking that on board, thinking about how I behaved or how I showed up, they weren't happy with that. So it created this real toxicity across the team. And there were a lot of other expats in the team too, for sure. But it just wasn't a nice working environment and not one that I was used to. And I made the decision when I went on mat leave that I wasn't going back.
Yeah, interesting. Do you want to talk our listeners through? You have a really beautiful cultural heritage that, again, the challenges of a podcast that I get to look at you and see that you have a very Asian looking face, and I can see then when there is a very Australian personality coming out of that Asian face can be quite confronting.
For sure. And I think for people here in Singapore, that was confronting for them, for sure. But yeah, I mean, in terms of background, Chinese ethnicity, so if you take it back to grandparents born in China, but they left probably in maybe after World War II. And so they moved to, dad's side went to Cambodia and mum's side went to Laos. And then, so mum and dad went to Chinese school in those places, but, small town, small cities, rural lifestyle. And during communism, they decided to separately, of course, they'd only met in Australia, but separately they made the transition to emigrate to Australia. And my sister and I were both born in Australia.
That's so cool. So talk me through then, you finished up work with, I'll see you when I get back from my leave, and you're like, see ya, never.
Exactly.
How long did you sort of have off work, and how long did you sort of start thinking, how long until you sort of started thinking like, okay, what am I going to do next and things? Because again, the fact that you have managed to have 3 jobs in 6 years here is also a very impressive thing for a lot of people that are in a that sort of trailing spouse experience, particularly in Singapore and in other countries where getting that working visa is a real challenge. How did it all sort of look after you poked your head back out of the fog post baby 2?
Yeah, so I'd say I probably started looking at about month 3 after baby number 2, and just started searching the job websites, LinkedIn, everything like that, and just to see what was out there, and applied for a number of different jobs. A lot of them wanted me to start right away, and I said no, can do. Like, I took 10 months off with my first, as typically in the Western countries you do take a big chunk of time off. Here it was 4 months at best, and so I already told my employer at the time that I wasn't coming back until the 10-month mark. Like, figure it out from a HR perspective. I'm not coming back after 4 months. It's 10 months. And couldn't reconcile that. Actually, they said I was the first person ever to ask for that amount of time. And somehow it kind of blew up their HR systems. In terms of looking, so month 3 started looking, and then did find something at about 8 months, 7 months after I had my child. And then I started at the 9-month mark with a new company. And super excited. It was an amazing company. But yeah, definitely happy that I made that transition out of where I was.
Mm. Mm. So how did you guys find, just taking it back then, first arriving and things, how did you hit the ground running with both of you sort of going straight into, like, husband into a new job and you sort of navigating, I say sort of almost a new job, because you were doing similar
Yeah,
things but in a different team and
exactly.
different office, different, all those sorts of things. What did it sort of look like those first few months?
So we did a lot of prep work before we got here. We were very lucky that we had a lot of friends in Singapore already from various pockets of our life, school, university. And one of my husband's best mates lived here for about 5 years. But by the time we moved here, he had already left. And so he gave us a lay of the land, like, these are the areas you want to be looking for condos in. They are really family friendly. And the condo that I live in now is one that he actually recommended because he was looking to buy here at the time. And so anyway, so we kind of had that as a first choice. And then so we already had done a lot of plotting and planning before we arrived. And I think that that's really important, is to not just come with no plan at all. And then, we just tapped into every single network that we possibly had for anyone that had been in Singapore to share tips, tricks, how to open a bank account, even, like, because what documentation do they need? Because you don't want to arrive with the documentation you need, and it's not here; it's back in Australia in some sort of storage cage or something like that. So yes, we figured it all out, and we're excellent planners, both my husband and I, and so we were very organized and got that done. But yeah, it was a little bit of extra help from the company in terms of the move, like temporary accommodation and things like that. But for the most part, we just came, picked up our 1-year-old at the time and started looking at houses right away. And we found something fairly quickly because, again, we knew where we wanted to be and we were able to narrow that down very, very soon. And then did the daycare, figuring out daycare before we arrived as well, and had reached out to all of that. So my tip is to organize everything as much as you can. Line up those interviews, line up those viewings, whatever you can before you arrive, so that you can hit the ground running.
You're ticking off lots of first boxes in this interview, Sandy. I have never had anyone this prepared. You usually, when I ask the question around, like, tell me what that first 3 months was like, and everyone's like, oh man, I was a hot mess.
Yeah. No, don't get me wrong, it was hard, and it was messy, just like any move is, and there were bumps along the way. But we tried to make it as easy for us as possible, just to, be as prepared as possible.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay, so because you're and again, an interesting use case to talk about. I'm really interested and exploring the end of expat life sort of cycle. So you have done that whole time, and you're now in the repatriation stage. Talk
That's
me
right.
through. You guys are planners, so, like, if this is for people listening, if this is on your horizon, maybe take notes on what Sandy's saying. Like, what have you done? Actually, I'll take it back. When did you make the call internally in the family unit, and what has that sort of looked like when you're 2 weeks out from relocating home?
I think the move to Singapore, we had always looked at it at 2 years at a time. So again, that old chestnut of everyone wanting to be here, thinking that they're going to be here for 2 years, that ended up being 4, and then it ended up being 6. So to me, this whole time has felt like a working holiday. I never felt settled here. We managed to get PR here, and people were like, "Oh, does that mean you're going to live here forever?" And it's like, no, actually, no, it isn't. We only did that because of the certainty to kind of stay in case our roles, were a bit uncertain. But anyway, I mean, we looked at that, and I still have crappy furniture that I brought over, and was thinking that we would be here 2 years tossing. And 6 years later, we're still using that crappy furniture that we never invested in. And so for us, it was always like, when are we going to go back? And I think that from the day we first arrived, that was a question we always asked ourselves. And so it was almost like we never really allowed ourselves to think that we would be here long term. It was always a very short to medium term. So coming to that point of when are we going to go home? That was a very often asked question, and a question that our family and friends kept asking all the time too. And I'm sure you get that too. But yeah, we made that decision earlier this year and it was the natural inflection point anyway. Our youngest is about to start kindergarten, and cost of living in Singapore has skyrocketed, and obviously our salaries haven't gone up by any. That it didn't make as much financial sense to stay here anymore and still miss out on all the intangibles: family time, friends time, establishing roots, having an Australian upbringing for our kids. So we made the decision earlier this year that we would finish off the year, which is now, and head home. And 6 years was a good run. I think we got the most out of it in terms of career-wise, and our second child was born here and was raised here, and we had the hired help and all of that. Like, we embraced it all, but it's not home. So at this point, it's time to go home.
So what has that looked like on a practicality side of things? Like, what do you actually need to do to return home? What does that actually look like? As far as other than booking plane tickets and ending your lease, like, what does that actually look like?
I think it's much easier to go home than it is to move to a different country, for sure. I mean, you don't have the visa issues because you've got citizenship. It's almost like it is a move that you need to think through. So you've got to think through where you're going to live. You've got to think through all the interim periods of what happens if your shipping hasn't arrived and where you're going to go and the schooling. So again, in full organizational mode, we researched all of that. But we're also very lucky because I think I mentioned earlier, like, we had bought a house just before we moved to Singapore. And so we're going to go back into that house. So we have that already lined up. The tenancy for the people who are living in there is really not that far off the time we're arriving back. So things kind of fell into place very quickly. And we had thought all about that in terms of always, because we were always thinking, when are we going to go back? What if it's next year? We kind of never allowed tenancies to go on for that long. It was always like, well, we need to be able to have the ability to break it. But yeah, so in terms of that, this is just the logistical things. But then also for me, because I work in global mobility, like, I know what the tax implications are. I know how to manage a relocation. I know, all those kinds of things. So I have that background to be able to do this well. But having said that, it doesn't mean that it's going to go without bumps. I mean, we all know that every move has challenges. But yeah, it's just a lot of organization and early planning, I'd say. I come back to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually the first thing that I thought about when we arrived and started unpacking was that impending dread of having to pack it up again.
Oh gosh, yes. Yes. I know. It's a lot. Like, it's amazing how much you've got. And so we're trying to sell as much as we can and donate as much as we can, because the thought of having some of this stuff go back home with us, I don't want to open that box and see it. Like, I just don't. So, we're only taking the bare necessities is what I'm calling it. And then the rest, we will just build from there.
Yeah. We very much came with a tiny house attitude to how we packed when we left Oz in the first place. And we sort of thought, like, we had been over without the kids prior to coming, so we had found somewhere to live. So we had signed a lease and paid rent for a few months while we were still in Oz, which was absolutely a killer as far as the bank balance. But it meant that everything was measured up. We knew what we could send. We knew what would fit and what wouldn't and things. And so we very much sent bare essentials over. I have these fears of, like you said crappy furniture over that you would plan on, like, getting rid of in 2 years when you then come home. The bits that I bought once I was here, it's like, pretty basic IKEA stuff that I'm like, oh gosh, imagine if we end up staying here for 10 years, we're going to be the same as you guys, that, like,
still looking at that IKEA furniture.
100%. But it's so funny because you go and visit people's like places and you go around for a drink or dinner or something and everyone's got the same setup.
Yeah, I mean, our stuff is so mismatched. It really is. But we're hoping to go back with, and create matching furniture that suits the style of our home when we go back. But we've never been able to do here because we're renting. It's not
Yeah.
ours.
Yeah. And it's like that whole concept of sort of almost living in a uni house, isn't it? Where it's all the
Yes,
hand-me-down furniture and
yes,
things. So
yeah.
do you think that, I know that you guys have been sort of planners and doing things in a 2-year chunk, but do you think that there is an element of like wanting to nest and wanting to be able to paint and put holes in the wall and to buy matching furniture? Do you think that's been anything that's sort of played in your decision-making mind at all?
To go home,
Yeah,
yes.
like as far as
Yeah,
nesting in your house, like you
yeah,
bought a house that I assume you didn't live in, and
sure.
then you
Well, yeah, we lived in it for a very short time, and then moved back out again to come here. But yeah, for sure. Like, I want the kids to know that it is there, like it is our house that I want to create together, not carting, IKEA furniture around with in an apartment that's not ours, that people complain if you put a hole in the wall and things like that. So yeah, for sure. I miss my beautiful kitchen. That's nice and big, and I miss the view from my house. Like, of course, yeah, for sure. And so that's a big part of it, and that forms part of the lifestyle in Australia, right? We do have a lot more space, and when we go back, there will be 270 degrees of parkland in front of our house, and I want the kids to ride a bike there, that kind of thing. So that piece of nesting, yes, does play a massive part in our decision to go home, and for our kids, by the time we go back, they'll be 5 and 8. And that is the perfect time, I think, to really build on what it means to have an Australian lifestyle.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm always really interested to then talk to people who are at the end of expat
Mm.
experience. Do you have any little tiny bit of you that if for either of you someone threw a curveball and was like, right, this opportunity of a lifetime has come up, will you guys move here? Would you turn it down now or would you take it?
Without going into too much detail, that nearly happened about 3 weeks ago. And so we were battling the curveball. I know it was the 11th hour. And so we were scenario planning for two situations. But yes, and so we would never turn down an amazing experience, an amazing opportunity. That goes without saying. And I think our expat life of having, London didn't quite work out the way we wanted it to, but we were still there for a period, and then Singapore, that we are very adaptable, we're very flexible, and even with 2 kids in tow, we can do it. So yeah, we would always consider it. We wouldn't say no immediately. We would figure it out and wonder whether the considerations were sound, in order to turn this decision around.
So I'm hearing you're not done.
We're done for now. We're done for now. Um, but never say never. I mean, I had a neighbor here, who came at the very end of their career. And so it was their last expat arrangement. Their kids were grown in their 20s, married, close to married. Husband was the trailing spouse. I saw him in the pool every day, swimming laps. He was enjoying himself. And the wife was working, and kind of the last kind of hurrah before retiring. So we talk about that jokingly and saying, where would we go or what would we do? But yeah, I mean, even if an opportunity came up 4 or 5 years later and it was an amazing one, we would always consider the pros and cons of it. We're not going home forever. If we are, that's great. But if there is another opportunity, we would absolutely consider it.
Mm. So I feel almost silly asking spreadsheet extraordinaire and planner from
Yeah.
career planner. Um, what's something that you wish you had known that even with all of that planning didn't sort of cover for you?
I think you need to go out and create your network. And it sounds silly, but when you're back home, you have a network of friends from your entire life, from school, university, work, you have family friends, you have extended family, all of it's there. It's very accessible. You tap into that, everyone's available. You come to a new country, you have to start from scratch. You might have some connections already, like we did, but they're not connected in any way. They're like one person from school, one person from uni. So, I was listening to all the interviews that Michelle Obama did with her book recently, and she talked about her kitchen table, and she talked about going into the White House and having to recreate or create again what her kitchen table looked like, and that meant all her friends around the table. Who does she go to when times are tough, and who does she celebrate with? And I think for women, and I'm going to generalize here, but for women, you need your girlfriends. And my girlfriends are all back home, living a very different life, not experiencing Singapore at the same rate as I am. And so I had to find people here in Singapore that were in the same stage of life, people who were maybe have already had one child, or maybe about to have their second, that kind of setup, who were, 10 years, 15 years into their career, that kind of thing, to create my own kitchen table. And that has allowed me to really enjoy my time here, because I have girlfriends, I have people I can moan about and complain about, but celebrate with and lift each other up. And that has been really important to me. And for those ones that are going to be listening to this, I really, truly thank them from the bottom of my heart, because I don't think I would have been able to get through all the trials and tribulations without them.
I love that analogy of the table. I like that. I'm gonna pinch that one. Thank you, Sandi. Yeah. Well, thank you, Michelle Obama.
Yeah, exactly.
I was thinking while you were talking about that, that ability to build your own network is not a skill that everyone has, and it's not something that comes naturally or comfortably to a lot of people. What are some of the on a more personal note for you, what are some of the strategies that you used to fill your kitchen table with that new crowd of girlfriends or support? Like, how did you actually do that as a well, and especially because you had a job as well when you were doing this as well, a job and a small baby?
I would say don't ever shy away from the opportunity to connect with someone. So if it was a daycare drop off and another mum was dropping off, say hi, introduce yourself, find out what they're up to, who they are. And I think often you can make a very quick judgment in terms of whether you want to be friends with them or not, or whether they want to be friends with you or not. And so I think that kind of like kids environment, with daycare, and also at the pool where we live, is like, right, it is an amazing spot to meet people, and kids connect and parents connect, and our community within our condo, work. And then just the people that you knew from back then, get them to introduce you to their friends, their kitchen table, because you could join theirs very easily too if you all get along really well. So we've kind of picked up a ton of friends along the way, and just connected in all different ways. And some, they fizzle out after a few months of being friends, and some stay the course.
I've talked about this on several episodes, that this expat experience can quite often, it's almost like teenage crushes, in that like it goes really serious and really hardcore really fast.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. And I think that there's an element of that again, going back to that kitchen table analogy, is that people are craving that, or are actively looking for those, filling the seats around the table, that it almost like gives you a bit more confidence to go and do things that you wouldn't normally have done, to meet people and to do things. Like I caught up with a friend yesterday. Sorry, Siri is trying to interrupt me. I caught up with a friend that was filling me. Well, no, sorry. I caught up with a friend this week and she was telling a story which I was in hysterics laughing about, but she had met this family at IKEA and was pushing the trolley around, and it was in the lead up to Deepavali, and this woman is a Kiwi married to an Indian guy, and so she was buying lots of candles, and she started talking to this Indian woman, and she said, "You've got a lot of candles there," and she said, "Yes, I'm married to an Indian, and we're having this big party." And she said, "Oh, well, look, we've just come here. My eldest son is going to university here." And my friend just was like, "Oh, okay, cool. Well, why don't you guys come?"
Yeah.
And people that you've literally met for 5 minutes in the line at IKEA or the supermarket, or I've done the same thing like next to the netball court watching my kids play sport, have asked people that I've sat next to for lunch the next day. I think it's such a interesting place to sort of test that extrovert skills that you might not have ever flexed previously.
Yeah, I mean, I did that actually. For those of you that had children in Australia, you would know that the local community puts you in like a mother's group, and you can join that, and you can.
Some places, not all places.
Not all
Rural
places.
Australia, not so much.
City Australia, very much so. But yeah, so it was almost like formed for you. It's like, hey, you're on this roster. You join and come meet all these 20 other mums who are having kids around the same age. That doesn't happen here. And so I kind of built my own mother's group when I had my child, because I knew how important it was. I had a wonderful one back home. And I knew how important it was to get through the first at least 6 months, if not longer. So I built my own. And all those friends that I mentioned who were in the same life stage as me, I was like, hey, let's join up once a week. We're going to do this, or twice a week, we're going to do this activity with our child, or go for a walk or whatever. And they were all, Singapore's close, so everyone's kind of close-ish. But what was interesting was I had a friend of mine back home in Australia whose best friend lived in Singapore. I didn't know her at all. And she heard about this whole mother's group that I was creating. And so she tapped into that, and she told her friend who I'd never met to come along to one of my kind of like mother's group things. And she did. And so she came, didn't know anyone, and she brought a kid, and we all just got along really well. And so I think it's also about finding, that network, or putting yourself out there to be able to create community for people around you also. And so many of us are still friends to this day. And our kids have all grown up together, which is really nice too.
I love that. I think sometimes that regardless of where home is, I think we get sort of lazy. I don't think there's actually any other way to put it. Lazy in that you're like, well, I've already got my group of friends. I've got my people. I don't need new friends.
Yes.
So you're not particularly great at being that open and welcoming. And I feel that then becomes quite cliquey, and it's really hard quite often moving domestically for people. I think that's just such an interesting nuance to a place like Singapore where there's a big expat sort of turnover. But I think a lot of people that have their trailing spouse experience in places that is not expat heavy, it's really challenging as well, because there's not people like you. It's like you're trying to crack into the local crowd that's there. And and especially if there's a language barrier, it's such a challenging thing to do. But I think you're right, like being able to leverage, even if there's just one person that you can connect with, and it's a friend of your neighbour's, nephew's dog.
Yes, exactly. Find the connection.
Yeah. Well, look, Sandi, if you have got one piece of gold nugget advice that if it was like for actually anyone at any stage, I was going to ask you I'm going to rephrase that. Have you got a piece of advice for anyone that is wrapping up their trailing spouse journey? Anything that you could give as a sort of mic drop moment of advice for people?
I think I touched upon it before, in that don't think that this is the end. It may be, and if that's how you want to plan out the rest of your life, or at least the next 20 years, that's fine. but be open and flexible to whatever comes your way. Of course, it makes a huge difference in terms of how are your kids settled in school, and you might not want to pull them out when they're about to do their final year exams and all that kind of thing. But we talked about, my husband and I talked about the flexibility around what does it mean if you were to turn that decision around. So my advice would be open and flexible.
I love that. What a perfect piece of advice to finish off on. Thank you so much, Sandi, for your time. It's been super interesting, and good luck with the packing.
Thank you so much. It's not fun. All right. Thanks, Joe.